So for this webinar today, what our idea is that we're talking about a lot of the specifics about how to manage open data. And in the tutorials, we've already been getting questions that, take it a bit broader than that. How can we use open data? How can we, and the politics around it. So I thought it would be a great opportunity to invite Frank Pichel, who works at the Cadasta Foundation, one of our highly valued partners in the land sector, to tell a bit more about his experience and Cadasta's experience about open land data, and to kind of get the discussion going about the context we're working in. Because obviously we talk in this course about opening up land data, and there's mention of data ethics and responsibility in publishing and using data. So I thought it would be great to use this opportunity to talk about that a little bit more. So I have prepared a few questions for Frank. And of course, we also encourage you all to use the chat and post your own questions, because we would like this to be an informal atmosphere and just having this conversation amongst all of us and talk about open land data. So thank you so much, Frank, for taking the time to talk to us today. Yeah, if you would please introduce yourself and maybe tell us a little bit about Cadasta and the work you guys are doing.
Sure. Well, thanks very much for that introduction, Lisette, and thanks for including me in this discussion today. Really excited to talk about land and open data and property rights. Something I'm quite interested in and is really core to Cadasta. But maybe I'll step back and tell you a little bit about how I became involved in property rights and how Cadasta tends to look at open data in land information. But my background is very much in land administration, and specifically using technology to make the collection and sharing of land information data easier. So with that kind of background, I tend to kind of narrowly focus on registry and cadastral information, the legal description of who owns what and the cadastral layer of where those parcels are. And my background in kind of the formal sector and very much top down was in oftentimes putting in those national level registry and cadastral systems. But after years of doing so, I think there was so it sounds a little bit muffled.
Yeah, I guess I'm commenting.
Is that any better if I go off the headset?
I think it's clear.
All right. We'll give it a try without the headset. But working from a top-down perspective is there's that realization of the formal data is but a fraction of the real information on land use, land occupancy, and where those land rights are. And so it was in that context, and we started looking at these top-down projects that implement a national registry and cadastre. Even where they were successful in many of the countries, you'd look and see, well, there's only 20–30% coverage of the land information. There's a huge gap that's not being displayed or shared. So with Cadasta, we take an approach of bottom up. So working more directly with communities, with local governments, with customary groups, with slum dwellers associations, to provide a tool and a platform for collecting and managing land ownership or land rights, and recognizing that those are often de facto rights that are recognized within the community, but perhaps not de jure legal rights that are backed up by a title or deed. And at Cadasta, we really provide all those tools free to use for our partners and the general public, as well as help those organizations in thinking through how to collect data and what data will be most valuable, most useful for eventual recognition of rights, some interim step, maybe it's a land use certificate, and put them on a path towards greater tenure security. And obviously data really is at the cornerstone, and we're trying to bring together that informal, although often locally legitimate data with the national level data sets. But the reality is that national level open data sets in land are relatively rare, particularly in emerging economies.
Great, thank you. So the participants of this MOOC were all focusing on food security and the sustainable rural development context. So how would you say that land and land administration data is important for those global goals?
Sure, and obviously, somewhat a biased perspective, perhaps, but I really see property rights as the cornerstone in development. Whether that's going to be an urban infrastructure project or increasing agricultural productivity or ensuring more beneficial benefits from natural resources for local communities. And from an agricultural development perspective, again, I really see that gap in data and that lack of tenure security as affecting people's decisions. When people don't know that they're going to have a secure right to their land next month, next year, or in 5 years, they're going to make decisions that are often shorter term in duration because there's not that confidence to make a long-term investment, whether that's in an irrigation scheme or switching to a high yield cocoa or palm oil plant, but that's going to take 3 years to mature. You're going to say, look, I want maximum productivity while I have the land. So tenure security is key to those longer term decision making, but also that data on the land itself, the soil types, slope, etc. That is often not property rights related, but were it publicly available and truly accessible, particularly by smallholders, it can help inform decision making.
Absolutely, yeah. You can hardly blame smallholder farmers for not investing in long-term practices for their land if they can be displaced tomorrow with insecure land rights. Absolutely agree. So why do you think land tenure data is generally considered sensitive or a controversial topic to publish?
A couple of reasons. I mean, one, I think we could be a little bit cynical and say we know that the land sector as a government sector globally is the third most corrupt government sector behind the police and the judiciary. And oftentimes those with large land holdings are also the political or economic elites of countries. So there's probably a disincentive for making that data open. Were the general public and the voting public aware of perhaps who was actually behind a lot of the large land holdings? The other reason it's sensitive is by its very nature, there's going to be personally identifiable information. I mean, a registry in cadastre is really the description of where the rights apply, the parcel, the physical location, what the rights are, and who possesses those rights, whether it's an individual, a family, a corporation, or a customary group. But by that very nature, again, you have that personal information about a land occupant. And depending on the degree of tolerance, if you will, for open data within a country, there's going to be different norms. And perhaps what's acceptable in one country won't be acceptable in another.
No, absolutely. So, I mean, it's interesting to see how that differs per country, how open land registry and cadastre data are, because I live in the Netherlands and it's at least bulk information is not available for free. So can you tell us a little bit about the different streams, how the streams of thought are with what should be open and how different governments, both in the global north and south, deal with that publishing cadastre data?
Good question, and it's something we've seen countries work with in a number of ways. In the U.S., land records are kept at the county level, so that's very complex, as there's 3,500 jurisdictions with their own land records. And about 20 years ago, when they first began digitizing them, there was a realization that there's a big difference between a public data set that's accessible in the county courthouse in that specific county versus one that's going to be publicly available via a web portal and someone could anonymously search. And the initial reaction at the county level, again, 15, 20 years ago was, okay, we have a legal obligation to make it open, but there's also a risk we're potentially exposing ourselves to. And I think it was, the Secretary of State, Colin Powell's property rights details were thrown up on the Washington Post, again, 20 years ago. All public information, but they could see how much she paid, how much was left on the mortgage, what the tax details were. And I think there was kind of a national sort of, oh, wow, moment of, this is really powerful information that we need to be careful about, because we've just put our Secretary of State's home address and all of his personally identifiable information out to the world. So the way the counties worked around it was freely available, but you had to come pick up your login at the front desk of the courthouse. So it kind of rolled it back and made it actually not available. Since then, I think sensitivities have lessened a bit, and most county data is accessible, but it's really not bulk records. You're looking at a snapshot of that one county. And I think that's the approach you've seen other countries take, where, like in the Netherlands, you can search individual properties, but bulk downloads aren't possible. And still other places, I think we've seen, I think there is an example in Rwanda where the data was, and legally should be public, and was public and up on an open data portal until maybe February or March of this year, when I think there might have been a realization of what that might be for large landowners who are politically connected, and that data came down. And that's not unusual. I think as we see more and more digital land information systems, making the data public is as easy as changing the access rights. Convincing governments that it's safe to do so is another question.
Absolutely. So I just wonder, when you work with your partners, you're working and helping them collect land tenure data, or at least parcel data, and who's the owner, who lives where. And you're an open data advocate, Cadasta. So how do you balance the two? Because obviously completely open has its risks. What do you tell your partners about open data?
Actually, and that's been an interesting challenge, and something that kind of went against our early assumptions when we founded Cadasta. And our thinking really was that for those lacking some recognition of the rights, by putting themselves on the map, so to speak, and claiming a right publicly, they'd be strengthening that right, particularly when there's supporting evidence of that right, whether it's in the form of attestations or ground rent receipts or utility bills, whatever it might be. But what we found early on was that I think 90% of our partners were keeping the data completely private for a variety of reasons. Whether it was fear of government recognizing that they are making a claim and they're going to want to squash that claim as quickly as possible, or because of the amount of personally identifiable information. So we've been working now with partners to get really quite a bit more granular in how their data could be shared. So I think in the next couple of months, we'll see some options where they can get really, again, granular in terms of what access rights to what data they put on the platform might be. So what is fully public, what might be available to members of their project, and what might be available to the community could all differ. And further to that, we're now building into our partnership agreements the ability to anonymize and roll up the data. So at least the metadata could be used, even if it may be a district or subnational level of knowing that these are the number of hectares claimed, these are the number of claimants, this is the type of land use, and perhaps these are the parcels. Less sure on that one. But we really do, we advise our partners, but leave it to the partners to make the decisions on what they'd like to make public.
Yeah, I understand. So in this MOOC, our participants are learning how to share open data and how to manage it and how to make it open. Licensing is coming up in a unit soon. So when it comes to land tenure data, what would your advice to them be if they're an intermediary, maybe not collecting data, but working with portals or repositories to publish data? What would your advice be for them if they do come across land tenure data, and how to publish that or not to publish?
Yeah, no, and one of the challenges I think is that oftentimes governments don't really understand open data, and they think just displaying it somehow or making it accessible in some way is open data. But if we kind of think back to what the definition we use, we'd find that probably there's less open data than we'd like, for sure. And also, again, coming from my sort of perspective on it being registry and cadastral data that I focus on, is that the data that is available, how accurate is it? We were just talking, I was just talking yesterday to a World Bank task manager designing a large land project. And they're going to be digitizing all of the historical survey and registry records. But there's a big debate over, should they be bothering with that when they've kind of found that, I think on a quick examination, about 80% were either completely outdated and incorrect or just incorrect. So yes, they're going to make that data open, but it's not good, not necessarily good data. So I'd just be careful when looking at, again, registry cadastral data, what is official data and what is, I guess, legitimate and accurate data might not be the same and probably aren't.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's something that came up with a lot of the participants in our tutorials as well, that were saying there's open data. I see these open data portals, but where is the quality data that we can use? So that's definitely, yeah, that really resonates with, I think, a lot of the participants as well. So I just want to take also a minute to encourage participants, if you have questions, I see Michelle just said hello. Please feel free to ask questions, because I'll look at the chat and I can pose them to Frank as well, because we'd be happy to have your inputs. So I have another question about, well, this is really about your personal opinion. I mean, I can understand there is no actual answer or right or wrong answer to this, but how open do you think land data should be, land registry data should be? Like, you have parcel boundaries, you have value, transaction history. What, in your personal opinion, would be open land registry data that both incorporates privacy and protects people, but still gets the the granularity that you were mentioning, that it can be useful still?
Sure. No, and yeah, I definitely have a personal opinion on it, but I really find it interesting, just how much those societal norms differ on what is an acceptable level of personal information to make available, and just looking at the difference between, the Netherlands, where it's relatively easy to search, at least on individual level, property records. And then, in Germany, where you can't show addresses on Google Street View. Neighboring countries, but very different perspectives. So, we have to, I guess, take what I'd like to see is sort of a broad, acceptable definition in what is open data and registry and cadastre, because we often advocate for it, but don't have a mutually agreed upon definition. When I look at what are the most basic levels of data that should be open and accessible, I'd say, what are the state-owned lands and how are they owned? In emerging economies, you often find that, the forest reserves aren't even well mapped. That's a core question that people will have, whether they're investors, farmers, et cetera, when they're setting up. So, what are the state-owned lands, the parcel layer, where are the parcel boundaries? What is the type of use if there's zoning for it, i.e. is it residential, is it commercial, agricultural, how can it be used? The land value, and I'd say that based on the transaction history and the property tax amount. What you'll often find is that property tax is a very easy tax to collect. A lot of times jurisdictions collect property tax without really caring who has the formal right. They just want someone to pay for it. On the other hand, property tax is a very corrupt tax, potentially, because it's often collected door to door, you could probably sway someone's opinion as to what the value is by a nice home-cooked meal or something along those lines. So that's what I'd see as kind of the most basic, because if we had the details on the parcels, clear information about what the transaction history is, publicize what the property tax is, and at the same time you can automate that property tax with the information on parcels, we could do a very quick and dirty land assessment based on parcel size, building construction material. And now you've got a transparent, equitable way to tax people, and I'm sure are going to increase tax collection. But yes, that's what I'd see as the most, I guess, base layer: the ownership type, the parcel data, transaction history, tax value, tax history.
Right. Okay. I see that Sinead has a question. Let me just repeat it for the recording. Does Cadasta engage with or envisage engagement with biodiversity data, e.g. mapping gene banks and natural resources?
Definitely, and maybe in two ways. One is, where there's existing data, we'd like to be able to pull it into our platform so that those using it can overlay, the information that they're collecting, whether it's community boundaries, parcels, areas of interest, with, broad data sets, whether it's going to be biodiversity, soil types, topo maps, water level table or water table levels. But then we also, from a different perspective, we want to provide the tools so our partners can collect the data that they need. And what we often find is, parcel data is a part of it, whether at the community or household level, but they're also mapping areas of interest, which are often those natural resources, and then assigning what the rights are to those resources. We've got a partner in Colombia working in community lands, that a lot of the resources are traditionally for women or youth or men or elders in the community. So they're kind of mapping those access rights of natural resources within the community and using it on the platform.
Great, thank you. Nestor has a question too. Land tenure projects are funded mainly by development funding. What should funders' role be to make land data open?
Yeah, and I'd say from that regard, there has been a little bit of perhaps a shift in the last couple of years, where I've seen and spoken to a number of folks that do design work for donor-funded land projects, and are now mandating that some level of the data be public. There was a case and I'm not sure it's, I'll speak generally about it, in Central Asia, where the country was really fighting making their parcel data public under a donor-funded project. And the donor mandated that the data be public. And and this is in the last year, within about 3 or 4 weeks, that cadastral office had received thousands of queries from the general public who were saying that the data about their property was wrong. This person doing the design work or managing the donor-funded project was very worried that the government would quickly just shut that down and say, we don't want to deal with this. But they actually took the proactive approach of saying, wow, we're getting crowdsourced data verification happening now. And now we can prioritize how to go back and verify this data, check and correct as needed. So that's exciting to see, and I hope that can be an example of what the power of open data can be. Don't be afraid of it. Let's not be worried that it's inaccurate, which we spoke a little bit to that accuracy question. But let's get it out there, because it's only through making it public that we can clean it.
Yeah, and can start the conversation, definitely. Frank too has a question. How can one make use of open data on land tenure? Well, you already said it a little bit, but maybe other examples of use of data?
Yeah, and so one of the examples that kind of comes to my mind, and we've been doing with one of our partners, but so often our partners are informal or limited tenure security. But what they don't know is what are the legal claims to the land they occupy. So we had a partner in Liberia and work a bit with a group called Aid Data that had mapped a lot of the concession information for Liberia. And what's interesting is the concessions in Liberia are managed by a variety of institutions. If you're getting a timber concession versus a mining versus an ag, all different ministries not talking to one another. Not to mention they're not talking to the registry and cadastral offices either. So Aid Data had gone to each of these different ministries, collected data on their concessions, and then gone out and mapped them. And what was quickly, abundantly clear is, 200% of the country's land area is covered by concessions. Obviously, there's an error there. And it's not just different concession types that are overlaying. It might not be a problem if there's a mineral exploration license over a oil palm farm, but if there's 2 oil palm concessions in the same location, you're definitely going to have a problem. And not to mention taking into account who are the household and community level land occupants that might be having their rights infringed upon. So when I think about how the data can be used, again, coming from a somewhat registry cadastre focused perspective, it's making clear where land claims are, being able to search those and compare them to official records and perhaps overlay them. There's an example, I think, in Sao Paulo where they overlaid, once the data was made public, looked at politicians. And I think politicians own something like 30% of the city. I could be way off in my numbers, but just a quick check of who are the politicians or political elite and who are the landowners, and made for a very interesting journalistic, investigative journalism piece in Sao Paulo.
Yeah, definitely. So John is asking, how can smallholder farmers who feel insecure be engaged in open data on land tenure, and how can they be encouraged?
Oh, John, great question and very tough question. I mean, it's so an open data by its, almost inherently by its definition requires technology to interact with. And your smallholders that are worried about, school fees, et cetera, the last thing they're concerned about is, getting online to search an open data portal and figure that out. Particularly, it's probably in a non-native language. It's going to require that technology, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, in part, it is through engaging through civil society actors, NGOs active in the space, and making the data accessible in ways that might be culturally or technologically appropriate. So not relying on that open data portal, but perhaps something is, hard copies of maps are printed and shared, or there's a way to access the data through a CSO, through a government agency, whatever it might be.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So everybody has a different role in that ecosystem. So governments should publish the data, and smallholder farmers can act with it, help collecting, and civil society can help bridge the translation between data and smallholder farmers. That's, yeah. I see multiple attendees are typing, so I'll just wait for more question to come in. Sinead has another question. Have you found any ministries or regulatory structures that have been particularly useful in promoting your mission, or does it vary from country to country?
Good. So definitely it does vary from country to country, but I'd have to say, perhaps somewhat surprisingly or interestingly, often the Ministry of Lands, which is going to be dominated, by lawyers and surveyors, are more resistant to making the data open. It's the ministries of statistics and ministries of finance I've found that have been more interested, because they're less concerned about a strict legal definition of land rights and land ownership, Perhaps they're less possessive of the data because they didn't collect it as the surveyors do, or collect a fee on processing the transactions as lawyers and surveyors both often do. They just need the data for their own end use, whether it's statistical analysis or whether it's for revenue collection.
Right. Well, I see more questions are coming in. Florence is asking, how can we use open data to enhance nutrition security, not just at production, but also at other points of the value chain?
Yeah, Florence, that's a good question. And I'd be open to everyone's thoughts on this. I'm not sure I have an answer off the top of my head.
Yeah, I think it's what you kind of said in the beginning, and people are coming in, is that when you have open data on land tenure, that you have more security because it can be contested, and then people are more likely to make investments. Of course, that in their land. Of course, that's at the production level, but yeah, also in the other aspects of the value chain, I'm sure it can have an influence. Florence, if you would like to specify your question a little bit more, what you meant, we'd be happy to have another look. In the meantime, I'll go to Mario's question. Can apps be used as a tool for the Cadasta data collection?
Indeed. So, and that's a big part of the way we bring data in. I'd say the majority of our partners are using mobile apps, sometimes with other equipment like external antenna or higher end survey device. But we use Open Data Kit, Geo Open Data Kit, as well as a number of apps from Esri, Survey 123, and Collector, and we'll have our own open source app out in the next, hopefully by the end of the year.
Oh, cool. Abudu is asking, how can open data on land help address women's access to land issues? Very good question.
Definitely. And there's a lot of statistics thrown out and a lot of question as to, what is the level of women's land rights. But because it is often not an open data set, it's hard to know. So at the very basic level, being able to, once the data is digital, being able to ensure that women's rights are captured both in the event of individual ownership, but in the event of joint ownership, whether it's a spouse, whatever it might be, but that all names are captured for all right holders. But whether that's being done can be hard to tell if the data is not digital. So being able to quickly assess, how different jurisdictions are progressing in terms of more equitable land documentation, it's critical that the data is open to be able to really have an answer as to their level of effectiveness. Yeah,
I've actually heard from our mutual partner in India, Pranab Choudhury from NRMC India, that the tenure data was open, and then other people can go in and they looked at the names, and purely by interpreting this is a woman's name, this is a man's name, which of course is not foolproof always, but if it's open, then other people can put their interpretation, and you can get a better insight on which women own land, or how many women are at least a shared title holder. So really good question, Abudu. I see multiple attendees are typing. Very glad with all the active questions. Thanks so much, everybody. And thanks, Frank, for taking the time to answer everybody's questions.
Certainly.
Yeah, let's just... Okay. I guess Marcella is having trouble with the sound. I saw some other people saying that if you turn... Well, I can explain it by the sound, but that's not really going to help, obviously. Oh, wow. Questions are coming in. Florence is expanding on her question, like how would open data be useful, say, to post-harvest handling, storage, and transport, etc.?
Okay, no, great question. And now I see where you're going with that angle, Florence. And a big part of the challenge, I would say, and potential opportunity, if we look back at that number of 70% of land being informal and undocumented in emerging economies, there's a huge data gap there. People don't know what are the land claims, where it is, who's there. But that data is critical for organizations, for businesses, and for particularly for supply chains. We've got to have a couple of projects now that, again, not something that we would have targeted initially, but where we've had partners want to use our platform to collect data as a smallholder or a plantation buying sourcing from smallholders. Because while those smallholders might not have a title or deed, they're still advertising the cocoa or the palm oil as a fair trade product. Well, how do you track it down and show equitable sharing of the revenue from a product if you can't trace it back to its source? And there's no formal data set on that source. So what they've been doing is using the platform to map their smallholders so you can track something within the supply chain and really have a true end-to-end tracking of a product. And again, these businesses are less concerned about the title and more concerned about, well, as long as it's not in a protected area, as long as they're socially legitimate land occupants, we're happy to work with them, because we know if we were, as a company relying on just title holders or formal land occupants, they would not have anybody providing to their central plantation or whatever it might be.
Yeah. Abdul Malik has a question. How does Cadasta manage reluctance of small landholders to give permission to open up their data, especially in developing countries?
Yeah, and so, part of that is we work through partners. We're not the ones collecting data on the ground. I don't have the social legitimacy to walk into a village in Burkina Faso and be trusted to do something with their data. So it's oftentimes local civil society organizations or customary authorities that would like help managing.
Come back.
Sorry, not sure why I dropped off.
No, that's okay. That's just, it's always with these global webinars that happens. So I think we left off with Alfred Acheng's question. I already plugged Lamport a little bit. I hope that's okay. But he was wondering if Cadasta has any information / data about Africa, and especially Kenya, and how much of the information can be accessed, and is it possible to access the link?
Yeah, so I guess in total in Africa, that makes up about 60% of our work. And right now that would be probably about 200,000 parcels. In Kenya, we work with a couple, 3 or 4 partners, Ogek People's Development Program, Kivalini Trust, and one other. But to my knowledge, that data is not made public currently, though as we have our release of the Cadasta 2.0 platform in the next couple of months, at least the metadata should be rolled up and publicly available.
Great. Timothy Aforde is asking, why do you think people bribe across the globe for land services if open land data is easily accessible? I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, and I'd say part of the reason for the corruption is because it is not easily accessible. It's not transparent. It's not easy to query, to work with. So just to access the data, you often have to pay a facilitation fee, if you will. I think if we were to overlay countries with the least corruption in the land sector with countries with open data, there'd be a strong correlation.
Right. And Abdul Malik, I guess you got caught off halfway answering your question for Abdul Malik. So how does Cadasta manage reluctance of small landholders to give permission to open up their data? You started to mention that you work with partners, but yeah. somewhere
Exactly.
you
So
got
in
disconnected.
part, it is working with the partners that have the social legitimacy to be collecting that data in the first place and the trust of the community to manage that data and use that data. Um, we really, we work with those communities to say, what data should be public, and oftentimes they say, yeah, none of it right now. But we at least want them to be thinking about it and have a plan, as I said earlier, for kind of anonymized or rolled up the metadata at least to be public. Because ultimately we recognize and we certainly advocate for the fact that the data is not our data. We're merely a tool for capturing it and a portal for managing it, but it is the data of those smallholders and the community groups they're working with. So they can make those decisions as to what should be public or what shouldn't be.
Yeah. Busidi, I hope I pronounced that correctly, Lawal is asking how much information does Cadasta have about African smallholders, especially in Nigeria? And I think there's also a question about Cameroon. So we're going into specific countries now.
Yeah, so Nigeria, all of our work to date has been very urban focused. So I don't think we have any rural work in Nigeria. It's all been urban, peri-urban, particularly in slums that are looking for some degree of tenure security. I'd have to double check as to whether the data sets for Nigeria are open. In Cameroon, we're not yet working directly, though we have a number of potential partners and plans for activities. But the recent hostilities have kind of put the land work on a bit of a back burner in Cameroon for the short term. And with the government,
So
no, it's not a direct relationship.
Abdul Malik is asking, what is the ultimate aim or goal of Cadasta?
Sure. So Cadasta really was founded to provide the tools and services to support the documentation of land rights, particularly for those left out of formal systems, because they do make up the majority in many countries. And we recognize that the data has a use, even if informal, and that the very act of documenting and building a case file, if you were, of your land claim has legitimacy, in part because the land official data sets are so bad. In many of the countries I've worked, you'll find, court cases involving land disputes make up well over 50% of civil court cases. And the title or deed, because there's so much fraud and inaccuracy, is only a bit of evidence. It's not seen as the be-all, end-all as it might be in the Netherlands or in other jurisdictions. So being able to bring your own case file and show that, over the past 5 years, the community, I've had this land claim, it was mapped to this degree, it aligns with the national standards, the community agrees to my rights, I've been paying a ground rent to the government. You've now built a very compelling case as to what your de facto right is. And so it is in part that as well is how do we bridge the gap between the de facto and the de jure and give an avenue for legitimate organizations to collect and manage property rights data.
Great, thank you. I see that Frank too and Sinead are typing, so I'll just wait for their questions. There are a lot of Franks joining us today. Sinead is typing. Thanks everybody for such lively questions. It's really great.
Definitely is.
It's Ilke. She's the main moderator.
And the participants are coming from all global, mostly Africa, Latin America.
Yeah, I think we have most of the participants are in Africa. I mean, Ilke, feel free to jump in because you have more detailed information. But we have 960 people enrolled in this MOOC from all over the world with an interest in land data. So it's been really great, and everybody even in tutorials have been really active with questions, and so it's a really great group.
No, that's a great turnout. Glad to have that many folks interested in open land data.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Okay, so from 95 different countries.
Oh, wow.
Okay. Ogun Sesan Adiola is asking if you can expand more on the goals of Cadasta.
Yeah, I mean, in part, it really ties back to that data gap question, because we you know, and we've actually seen now some of our biggest projects have been working with government, but at a more local level. You know, I can look at a municipality in Zambia, and then in Odisha state in India. And in both cases, these local governments, state level and municipal level, have realized, well, we need data on these land claims. We don't have the ability to issue a title, but we can't afford to wait for the Ministry of Lands and the surveyors to come out and do the work, and the land occupants don't have the money to pay for that, nor is there necessarily a clear legal path. But what you are seeing now is the governments are saying, well, we'll get creative, and in the case of India, issue a 20-year certificate of occupancy that is non-transferable but is inheritable and mortgageable. And that's giving them the data they need to make planning decisions, to deliver services, to collect revenue, and it's also very politically popular. And for the citizens themselves, it's giving them the security now that they could leave the land to their heirs, that they can make longer term decisions, and that their rights are recognized. So I see that as a real, perhaps an emerging trend. Local governments, businesses, organizations can't wait for formal data any longer, given the size of the data gap, and are looking for alternative ways to inform their decision making.
Absolutely, yeah. Isi Mikalu is asking, is there any plan for Nigerian smallholders in the near future, aside of the slums and peri-urban areas?
There's nothing on the immediate horizon, but if you have some ideas, I'm more than happy to talk about it. I think there's so much potential in Nigeria, and you look at the urban growth rate. I think I heard the quote that in the next 20 years, Nigeria's growth will be 80% urban, and of that, 80% informal. And if that doesn't, terrify you, I don't know what does. I mean, that level of informality and growth is just incredible. By focusing on smallholders, in addition to how we formalize the informal slums, but you're often giving youth and others a reason to stay on the land. If you're very tenure insecure, you're probably going to go to where there's a better financial opportunity. If you have some degree of tenure security, you might now have a reason to stay in the village, stay on those rural lands. So all of that to say, my email address is fpichel@cadasta.org. Feel free to send me a line if you see some opportunities in Nigeria to partner.
Great. Yeah, we can share your email in the general MOOC so people can follow up, because I don't know if we'll have a chance to answer all the questions that are coming in, because we only have 7 minutes left. But I'll just pick a few. Sinead is asking, do you adapt your definitions, conceptualizations based on different approaches to land tenure, private versus public, community-based, etc.?
Oh, yes. So very much so. We probably have about 7 or 8 core standard questions that that all of our partners use, that kind of get to some of our key questions that would allow for us to have a single data set that we could roll up and have as a global data set. But then on top of that, we really do contextualize it to the partner. We take a hard look at the land administration domain model and ISO standard around land information, and how we can align the data collection with that, depending on what their ideal outcome is. And then we also look at the national standards, because where we can, we want to collect the required data in the mandated way, to allow for some eventual recognition of those rights. Now, the result of that is that we might have a partner like in India where formal rights are being granted with about a 20-question questionnaire. On the flip side, we have a partner in Indonesia that's really looking at supply chain transparency, and their question is about 400, questionnaire is 420 some questions. So we can get very flexible, and sometimes, I mean, we spent days arguing and bringing that 600 questions down to the 427 questions they had to have answers to. Probably is still a little bit of overkill, but that's if they've got the time to collect the data and willing smallholders that are going to answer questions for a couple of hours, that's their prerogative.
And the time to analyze, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, is you just have to wonder, are they going to have the time to put all that data to use?
Yeah, exactly. Abdul Malik, well, Alex Sambuni would like to work with you in Kenya, so that's also good. Alex will share Frank's email in the MOOC so you can get in touch with him directly to discuss possibilities. Abdul Malik is asking, has Cadasta ever had a situation of negative backlash or consequence of smallholders' land data opening? And if so, how was that managed?
Yes and no. So actually not on the smallholder side, and I guess the negative backlash was more in the terms of the way the data was being collected by a partner than in the data being public. In that with this organization, they brought in data collectors who'd worked in a different district and from a different district for mapping in an urban slum. So you can imagine the distrust when you suddenly have strangers with high-end equipment with large antennas walking around what the community members know as informal, and they're at risk of demolition or eviction. Strangers walking around measuring the land can raise a lot of questions. So we really work with partners to ensure that before they're collecting data, that there's a participatory process of defining what data is to be collected, how the community will be engaged, and a public education or public information dissemination campaign in the lead up to any data collection. But specifically around the data being made open, we haven't had a case with any backlash to date.
Okay, thank you. Well, we're reaching the end of our hour. I'll just take because I have the floor now, to take the last question, the honor of the last question. So the topic of today's webinar is open land data. You've shared a lot of examples and also the difficulties in open land data. Some even call it a paradox, that it does not go together. Would you call yourself optimistic or pessimistic in that open land data can be achieved globally?
Relatively optimistic, taking a longer term vision, I suppose. The big prerequisite is the data, getting the data to exist in the first place, and digital. I think once that can be accomplished, making it public, at least in part, will quickly follow. I think there's kind of a growing acceptance of open data, even with some portion that might be personally identifiable, and with work from organizations like Open Government Partnership pushing governments on open data, and with land being a focus area, there's more and more advocacy around it. So we just need to get the data in the first place, and then hopefully more and more of it will be made open.
Great. Thank you so much, Frank, for your time to talk to all of us. And thanks for all the participants again for all your lively questions. It's been great. If other questions come up, please feel free to put them on the forum in the MOOC. We'll share, as said, Frank's email there too, so you can contact him directly if you have any questions for Cadasta directly, or if you